Welcome everybody to War, Revolutions and Terror. I'm carrying on from my discussion of Marx, as I pointed out last week. That's going to be central to understanding what happens with the development of real communism. And we'll see different ways in which the Bolsheviks adapt Marx. In some ways, you could say radically transform Marx's theory. But the point I want to make also is that there are aspects of Marx's theory that if it were to be implemented, then changes would have to be made. And I think this even dawned on Marx quite late in life. I'll talk about that a little later. I want to run through the features of Marxism. Let me just say one other thing first, and that is that you'll recall that the whole idea about communism would be that there would be spontaneous cooperation around large-scale production. That's very important because prior to Marx, with some exceptions like Saint-Simon and some other socialists, but the longer pedigree of the socialist tradition had tended to focus upon more agrarian-like societies, so wealth production was not seen as a primary component of the project. Whereas with Marx, what he basically argues, or what he essentially argues, I should say, is that if we look at history, we can see different stages of economic development, and one stage outgrows another one because of increasing social complexity, and that increasing social complexity ultimately leads to transformation because of the class relations that have developed within that complex. You recall classes are really what occurs when you have a division of labor. And so, in a sense, along the different spectrum of the division of labor is where the classes form. The different things that people do ultimately binds them to a class. And then he argues that bourgeois society, which he says we now have, which is based upon private property, capital, the division of labor, capital investment, that this will ultimately lead to a situation in which there's such a crisis that communism is the solution to that crisis. He also had said, you might recall me saying, that communism is the solution to the riddle of history. So his view of history is such that we can see that there's this development that is taking place, and he believed that unlike other socialists, that he had a scientific understanding not only of history but of the solution to the riddle of history. We'll also recall that along with the spontaneous cooperation that Marx was talking about, a large-scale cooperation of division of the labour process, he also argued there would be no state, there would be no religion, there would be no money, there would be no private property. So, as I said last week, all these aspects of civilization that are developed over time, they're all seen rather than a solution as the kind of problem that has to be overcome. And Marx had come to this point of view in his early 20s. Now, as I said, he believed that he has a scientific explanation of this. And that he first of all expresses this idea in the Communist Manifesto, though there's some early writings which also are pushing in this direction. But it's in his work Capital, and especially in the first volume. He only lived to see the publication of the first volume. Friedrich Engels, his often collaborator, who collaborated with him, for example, on the Communist Manifesto, as well as a number of other works. In that, he lays out what he believes is the scientific explanation of why communism is something necessary. And this is very important because he believed that he had provided a formula for the nature of capitalist production, and in the very formula you could see the embryonic problem. Now, let me just say, on the basis of science, at different times he compares himself to a chemist, to a physicist, and to a biologist. But generally with science, it's not just a case of having a model or having a prediction. It's at some point you have to confirm and verify the prediction. The problem with Marxism and Marx's theory is that he never does any modeling to think of what could be wrong with the prediction. And this really is not very good science at all. Okay. So let's go into a few of the details. I just want to spell out, continuing on from the point I was making last week, why this is an economic theory about the development of society, but why there's serious problems with this theory. First of all, he argues that capital accumulation is the expropriation of labour power as profit of the capitalist is unnecessary. Now, that basically means that capital is theft. That formulation, private property is theft, had already been expressed by Pierre Proudhon. And Marx accepts that it is theft. And the reason he argues that it is theft is because he says all value is based in labour power. And that power, as opposed to capital, which is just using labour that's already been expended, and that labour that's been expended has now come via profit into the hands of investors, that is capitalists, people that own the means of production, important term in Marx. And he says labour power can ultimately be measured as the time required for social reproduction. So the quality of labour doesn't really matter. It's the quantity of labour power. And this, he says, you can actually measure this. So, and this is his formulation, formulation in terms of a kind of equation of the problem. He argues, and I'll give you a simple example. Say you're making shirts. The capitalist will supply, say, the cotton and the materials you use and the infrastructure, but he does that because someone else somewhere has produced that, and now he's got hold of this. The labour time expended is what is taken, is what is deployed in transforming those raw materials into the shirts, and this is the new commodity, is the shirt. So the money that is given for the payment of the shirts, so say all the raw materials cost $2, the shirts now cost $3, and the workers will get, say, $2.50. I'm just making these figures up. The other 50 is taken by the capitalists, and Marx says that is expropriated from them, it's stolen from them, because the capitalist is not needed. Now, let me just say that at the same time that Marx is using what this is called the labour theory of value, this theory had a pedigree in economics, but the problem was that at the very time Marx is making this argument, a new theory of value has been developed, which is the basis of modern economics. And that theory is often called the subjective theory of value. And that ultimately is saying, look, it doesn't matter how much labour you spend on something. The real question is, what is someone prepared to pay for that in the market? So if I go and dig a hole and I've spent all that time doing it, the fact that no one wants to buy my hole means that my labour has been useless. And that's a really serious objection. But that is raising the issue of the amount of money that someone can afford and the perception of whether that work has any value. So it's about the perception of value that gives it its value. Marx says that's simply wrong, that the price is really always going to gravitate around the time of labour that is expended. The problem is that he can't confirm that the work that's being done is seen as useful, and you can only understand the utility of that work by people's willingness to pay for that work. And obviously willingness to pay for it is bound up with the affordability of the commodity. So that's going to be a really important thing, because ultimately what Marx is doing is he's ignoring the market. In Marxism, market is a kind of surface phenomenon or an epiphenomenon. Everything that is really important is taking place within production. So the whys and wherefores, the wants, desires, the willingness of the consumer is really negated. And somehow in communism, there is meant to be a gauge, some way of assessing what consumers want by the producers. Now, this is a very tall order. It's much more complicated than you might think. It's why, by the way, liberalism, as a political economy that's based upon enterprise, exchange, perception of value, it often uses the formulation, the consumer sovereignty. The sovereign is consumer. Now, Marx rightfully understands that people can't all afford what they want. But that's not really the point of consumer sovereignty, because they factor in, the liberal political economy factors in the capacity to pay as well as the want. So that's really the critical thing. Whereas in Marx, that is just left to one side, and he never really returns to that. But in understanding any modern economic problem, you would see, well, you actually have to factor whether the consumers want what they're getting, whether they're able to, and the pricing system is basically a signaling system where a consumer can show that they're approving of the particular commodity that is being produced. And when they approve of that, that will generally lead to a couple of things. One, it will lead to more being produced as more consumers show that they want it. And two, it will lead to eventually, there's a possibility it will lead to the diminution of prices, because more and more capital will be injected into the making of that commodity. And as that happens, then it's able to be done cheaper. And you can see this with this. Let's take cars and computers, for example. We have seen since their development how in real terms, if we take into account not only the fact that a car is a car is a car, a computer is a computer, but the different qualities that cars and computers have developed over time, has meant in real terms, you can see they are much, much cheaper than they were when they were produced. And that is ultimately because of the very things that I've been saying. Because they've been looking for market share, and in going for market share, they're caught up in this competitive process. And being in this competitive process, they are looking for ways to either cheapen the commodity outright, or, which really is the same thing, give you more value for your money. Now, Marx is aware of this tendency for commodities to become cheaper as the division of labour expands around that and capital injection around about that. And he argues that surplus value can be accrued in one or two ways. One is called absolute surplus value, and it's not just the profit for him. Remember me saying it's time. So in Marx's theory, absolute surplus value means that you're accruing, say the worker is working for 8 hours and they're recompensed for 6. That means the capitalist is taking 2 hours of their work and they're giving that to the capitalist for nothing. Marx doesn't deal with the orchestration of the resources that the entrepreneur does. I mean, and that's why entrepreneurs or finance capitalists, as well as manufacturers, what they're doing is finding ways to attract capital to a particular production or commodity that is going to be produced. Now, Marx doesn't really care about that. In fact, he doesn't deal with that at all. What he basically thinks is things will be so socialized that we can just assume that there will be sufficient economic development for the different producers to make the decision about what it is they want to produce. But as I said, how do they know what they want to produce unless they know what consumers want? So this would suggest some kind of massive voting system on every kind of commodity, which the opportunity cost just in the time taken, as well as the ability to give a feedback of whether something's well done or not done. That is just something not in the system. Now, I mention this because when it comes to planned economies, that is to communist economies, which try and solve this problem by calculating the worth of every commodity. So they try and calculate the worth. They're just basically guessing. And so the consumer has no way of showing the producer that this is good. There's also no real incentive to create new kinds of commodities or to improve upon the commodities. Now, in the capitalist system, Marx says that apart from absolute surplus value, there's something called relative surplus value. And relative surplus value ultimately means you intensify the rate of commodity production. And you do that through machinery and technology. And it can also be through labour techniques. But ultimately, what you're looking at, says Marx, is you're looking at the fact that capitalists are able to create cheaper goods, not only because they expropriate those hours, but they find ways of displacing labour power by replacing it with plant and machinery, and so intensifying the productive process. So in a sense, then, labour becomes intensified. So there's an intensification. And this is, so in one sense, Marx is kind of right about that. The real question is, though, is capital something that you can just assume, or is capital something that also has to be attracted for commodity production through some kind of market mechanism? And that's really the issue. And Marx doesn't answer this, but communism in practice will answer it. Well, the way you can avoid that is that the state dictates that. The problem with that is whether the state's dictate of that is as efficient as the market dictating where capital should flow. And one of the reasons that command economies or centralized state-run economies didn't work is simply because that is a very, very limited way to attract resources. And ultimately, you're dependent upon some committee somewhere making a decision, and the brains of that committee, how capable they are of understanding human wants, how capable they are of dealing with the different alternatives that resources can be used for. And basically, the problem is this. In a market, you've got multiple thousands, ultimately millions, of brains operating at all sorts of levels of attracting resources. Obviously, the bigger the scale of the enterprise and the more you can monopolize it, the more that will have in common in some ways with the state command system. That's kind of true. But even then, there will still be the opportunity for some kind of competition to come along, ultimately to even replace the technology and technique. If you think, for example, of DVD players, this is a good example. You could say that a number of companies eventually control the DVD market. And then someone comes along with streaming and they're able to bypass that modality of technology altogether. And that therefore competes with that technology. So again, in a command economy, there would be no real reason for producers to try and think that far ahead. Ultimately, and as we'll see this, Marx is depending upon not the profit motive, but the social conscience of people to try and be more and more entrepreneurial. But they won't be entrepreneurial for profits. And that's really the problem, is that takes us so far that at the end of the day, the great developments in technology haven't just come from people with good hearts. It's come from people who are looking for profits. Now, going back to Marx and this labour theory of value, what he argues is that because of this relative surplus value, labour displacing technology, eventually you get to the stage where workers are so few and perhaps not needed at all that they're so completely displaced in this automated process. Then he says real value is not being produced. There's not real value anymore. There's utility value, but use value, as he calls it, but there's not any value that's transferring into profit, because the profit is ultimately accrued through the usurpation of the labour power of the workers. So what we see is this falling rate of profit, but the very source of the making of the profit, the workers, they're dwindling to such an extent they won't have any money, there won't be any real value, and this will lead to any exchange value being produced, and this leads to a complete economic collapse. So this is the theory. And he says this leads ultimately, because you've got all this plant and equipment and machinery, you've got all this infrastructure, and he's not wrong when he points out that with the development of capital, the socialization dimension of the means of production is increasing. And he looks at joint stock companies as an example of that. That's true. That's a half truth in that. But but in part, the problem is that Marx has put these things in complete opposition to each other. You've got private property, and ultimately you've got some kind of command system, let's call it the state, and in fact they work in tandem with each other. Now Marx would argue that the state is simply the means by which the ruling class directs resources for its own personal profit. And again, that's not completely wrong, but when Marx begins this theory, he doesn't believe that there's any chance that the working class will get any kind of parliamentary representation. But it is beginning, he starts to see the beginning of this in his lifetime. And we can see, actually, once that happens, that really all changes the name of the game. And so we start to see an interpenetration of the interests of capital and the interests of labour. And so there's what we can call a dialectical relationship. They develop in tandem with each other. It doesn't mean it's equal. So if you want to talk about equality as such in this abstract sense, no, it doesn't mean that. A market, by the way, is something that is fundamentally unequal. I explained that last week. It's fundamentally unequal. And the state is able to find ways to ameliorate some of that inequality. The problem is if the state intervenes too much, that the incentive for producers to devise new technologies, new ways of doing things, new kinds of commodities, etc., that will be extinguished. And this was the problem that the Soviet Union faced, China faced it, and ultimately that would lead the Soviet Union to dissolve, and China didn't need to break itself up because it had already decided to take capitalism, at least up to a point, bring it into its political system. And therefore it had really, in some important ways, ceased to be communist. Politically, it was communist insofar it was Leninist, and I'll explain a little later what Leninism is as a political formation. Okay, so Marx is saying, on the one hand, all the labourers of the world, and ultimately this is a global picture. And what is extraordinary is this is a global picture at a time when the Industrial Revolution is just taking off. So Marx hasn't had the time to see how this really plays itself out. It's all predicated upon a theory based upon this formula of commodity production. This is rationalism pure and simple. It's inference building upon inference, and you haven't got time. And you've got certain empirical features, things happening in the world that you see and you fit into your theory, but you haven't had the opportunity to see how it plays out. So you can't test your theory. And if you can't test your theory, it's not a scientific theory. So in Marx's vision too, society is really a struggle between these two classes. One he calls the bourgeois classes, the owners of capital, and one is the labouring classes. They own their own labour power. What Marx doesn't consider is the way in which labour power is an insufficient concept to really understand what's happening in the division of labour. And I'll come to that in a moment, but I'll just say this, I'll reiterate that he is, because he's dissolved quality into quantity, and he's used this term labour power, the defining feature of the proletariat in a Marxian theory is basically it's all replaceable. It's not, it's something that can be trained up to do certain things, that's true, but the skills in and of themselves are just, they're secondary to the fact that you've got this massive labour to draw upon. And Marx also argued that under capitalism there would be this permanent army of the unemployed that it could draw upon. Now, unemployment is a serious problem within capitalist economies. And at different times there's more and different times there's less. And Marx seems to have a good argument for why there's unemployment, except there's another argument. And the straightforward economic argument is that in that particular branch where you're working, there's just a surplus of labour. So you don't need those people. They don't have the skills. Or at the moment, there's something like a credit crisis. And in fact, one of the problems here too with this theory is very often the major crises haven't been because of oversupply of production. That's what Marx is saying. We produce so many goods, and that's why we can all in a moment of crisis, if we just socialize everything and share out the goods, we'll all be fine. Whereas in fact, most crises happen because there's been such an expansion of credit that people are developing things that no one wants to buy. But that's not because of overproduction so much, that's because of too much credit. Okay, so communist society. Now, so the question is, why does Marx think that the workers of the world will unite? Workers of the world unite is a famous communist formulation. Why does he think they will unite? And this is a piece of rationalist psychology. Remember I said rationalism is when you just build inference upon inference, but you don't actually bring it back to reality. Even if in your original material to make or your original premise, you've got bits and pieces of reality in there. As it develops, reality starts to recede from view. And you can see here, this is all built around a particular view of human nature. In your use or enjoyment of my product, I would have this is under communism, I would have immediate satisfaction in knowledge that in my labour I had gratified a human need, that I had objectified human nature, and hence that procured an object corresponding to your needs as another human being. I would have acted for you as a mediator between you and the species. Thus I would be acknowledged by you as a complement of your own being, as an essential part of yourself. I would thus know myself to be confirmed both in your thoughts and your love. In the individual expression of my own life, I would have brought about the immediate expression of your life. And so in my individual activity, I would have directly confirmed and realized my authentic nature, my human communal nature. Now, this is the kind of rationality that we might attribute to saints. But to see this as the basics of why people en masse would work not for their own profit but for the good of others, there's one major problem with this, and I said this last week, and that's all of known human history. That historically people have either produced because they've been forced to do it or because it's profitable to do it. It all comes down to that. Now he is saying we will do it because we'll all be so enamored with our philosophical ideas such as what is a human need and what is human nature, and I am a mediator. It's philosophical drunkenness. And I won't say anything more about it, but there it is. And it's incredible how little known this passage is, but it's the only place in Marx where I think he really spells out the motivation besides necessity that drives people to communism. And as I said, the capital, he's trying to give you an argument built around necessity that tries to avoid this rational psychology. But at the end of the day, you still got the fact that all these people with different skills, different attributes, different ways of spending their time are all going to come together for the social good. And if I was to say that the one weak point of all socialist thinking, and it's a weak point that goes right back, we can see it in Jean-Jacques Rousseau as well, is that there's a kind of harmony as a natural condition is being assumed. Harmony as a natural condition is being assumed, as opposed to harmony, and this is as opposed to the historical record, which suggests that harmony is something that happens bit by bit through a lot of struggle, a lot of sacrifice, revolution, conquest, and so on. Okay. So, I've said some of this already. On the right is a guy called Bernberg. He wrote a book that was very critical of Marx in the latter part of the 19th century. Karl Marx and the close of his system. The close of his system, and that's exactly what he's saying. It's a closed system. And he hasn't thought enough about economics. He's politicized his understanding of economics too much, and his politicization of it is too simplistic. So, although Marx recognized, let's see one tension. For example, the natural tension between finance capital and industrial capital. Now, there can be harmony as well, but there's often a tension between them. This is actually something that Marx talks about in his observations of the revolutions in France in the 1830s and 40s, and then in the coup of Louis Napoleon III. And he does talk about the different classes in a much more sophisticated way than he does either in Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto. The problem is that although he identifies there the different interests between finance capital and industrial capital, he doesn't follow this through at all. Whereas that contradiction can be really decisive. And to some extent, what's happening in the world today concerning the dispute, which is the biggest political issue of our time, between those wanting to keep globalizing and those wanting to resort back to a more nationalist ways of aligning capital and labor. We can see that the globalization has been driven by finance capital. Industrial capital has then followed that to some extent, but not completely. So it depends where your industry is, whether or not you're so happy to follow where financial capital is attracting more resources. And this is something that Marx just doesn't look at, because if capital is not unified, but if there's certain, and then it gets more complicated, because there are those that want more international, those that want more national, those that want tariffs, those that don't want tariffs. There's all sorts of potential for conflict between owners of capital. So the idea that they're really unified, homogenous in their interests, this is just politically wrong. I mentioned the difference between the producers and the consumers, the different interests. I've mentioned that the organisation of labour is not the result of spontaneity, but of necessity. I've mentioned his point is psychological. Why is history a story of conquest, plunder, enslavement, etc.? Why is the formation into groups we trust for protection rather than cooperation with strangers not our true nature? That's a very serious problem. And very often, not only did Marx not do any kind of internal critique of his own theory, but anyone who argued against Marx's view, he was a notorious bully. And in the labour movement, his faction were renowned for being very bullying, and that's just a fact. And so he believed, he was so assured of himself being right, and this is one of the serious problems that we face, not only with Marx now. This is a commonplace phenomenon in the 19th century, and it continues to this day, and that is people with ideas often become extremely defensive and protective around their ideas because they want to instantiate their view of the reality. But reality has a habit of not simply complying with someone's ideas, because someone, no matter how many books they've read, has got a very limited view of things. And I would say the same thing about Friedrich Nietzsche. In so many ways is the opposite of Marx, but in the 20th century it's very interesting how many intellectuals love Marx and Nietzsche, sometimes or, but very often and you think, wow, these people are so happy to find answers to everything. And this is ultimately what people like Marx and Nietzsche are doing. They're providing the big answers to all our problems. The question is, how solid are the answers? How do you test these answers? And as I said, they're not spending time testing it. It becomes a faith. It's like a religion. Also, what is going to be the incentive to keep it going other than complete identification of oneself with one's neighbour? And I said, this is all a psychological viewpoint. The political problem, as I also said, Marx requires identification with each other as species members, but this requires class elimination. But the fact is that different social position, different skill sets, different habits, you wake up in the morning, you make your way in the world through doing X, Y, and Z. Obviously, you're going to be very distressed if the opportunities to do X, Y, and Z vanished. So the idea that people will willingly give up on private property because, and what they, and their personal talents and skills, and just be directed by what some group dictates, and they have to dictate, and Marx will use the term the dictatorship of the proletariat. He sees this as a phase, but in the first instance, he said when the proletariat usurp power, they will have to form a kind of dictatorship. But again, who? And we can see this all played out. These aren't abstract questions, they're very real questions Marx never gives any thought to. And when we see it played out, we can see what the answer to this is. So why would people willingly sacrifice the things that they do, the things that they've accrued, the things that they want, to this more abstract general good? And the answer is, well, very few of them will. Very few of them will do this. And we will see over time that this is how this is confirmed in the practice. Can political leadership be eliminated if there's disputation about resource production and distribution? Obviously not. And one of the things that was happening even in the earliest phases of the Leninist revolt in Russia, which I'll be talking about at length, there's different times where, especially early in the revolution, the factory workers had taken control of the factories, but they would be often fighting with other factory workers over resources. This is inevitable. This is inevitable. Their first interest is in saving themselves. That's the way of the world. Would that it were not so. We've got saints that tell us otherwise. We've got religion that preaches otherwise. But in terms of mundane reality, it always seems to come out this way. Marx also seems to think that unskilled workers share the same interests, but this is ultimately any worker must have a skill set, to use modern parlance. And that skill set is ultimately something that will be attractive or not to someone with capital, someone wanting to invest in, or to the state wanting to employ or deploy labour. But again, at the end of the day, we will see that this can bring people into competition. Marx thinks if you get rid of capitalist world, you will get rid of competitiveness. Whereas it's competition and scarcity, or it's scarcity plus competition for resources, which has told the human story up to now. Ultimately, Marx does think that there will be a new man, a new world. It's a new kind of vision of reality, but it's all predicated upon abstraction. It's this set of abstractions, or it's not predicated upon anything that we have any real experience of. I'm not talking about short-term, momentary cooperative projects, but I'm talking large-scale society. Now, some of the problems, and we'll come back to Mikhail Bakunin. But Bakunin was an anarchist, and the anarchists ultimately wanted the same kind of thing that Marx wanted in the long term. They wanted spontaneous, cooperative, freedom, unimpeded by state and by church and all of these things. But Bakunin, who knew Marx and was supposed to translate the Capital for him, and ultimately ended up having a big fight with Marx, could see that ultimately what Marxism was nothing, he said, but red bureaucracy. And Marx really argued against this, strongly argued against it, but we will see in a moment that actually Bakunin, not only was Bakunin right, but Marx had changed his mind in such a way that he actually confirms Bakunin's position. Because Marx argues that there have to be certain historical circumstances that are met for the producers to form this dictatorship of the proletariat. And we will see that he drops that. So that in a sense, he walks away from his whole theory as he gets older. And he's walked away from it because he's basically come up against a theoretical dead end. Now, I mentioned Bakunin there saying that ultimately what Marx is doing is just trying to position his version of socialism and communism within the workers' movement to ensure that workers do and play by the rules exactly as he set them. But there's another question, and I had mentioned in another lecture, I think very early on, I think the very best book on political science that I could get you to read would be Gaetano Mosca's. This is written in the early 1930s, MOSCA, and you can get this on a website called archive.org. It's called The Ruling Class. Because what that is arguing is that any political formation always has an elite running it. So this raises the question, is revolution always a power transference from one elite to the next? Because any large-scale society requires division of labour. We said that Young wanted division of labour, and then he sort of dispenses with this idea, but he ultimately can't do this. You can't do it. And I think this is true. And I think what we saw this in the French Revolution, and we're going to see exactly the same issue rise in the Russian Revolution. So, now one thing I think is going to be very important. If we go to the last point on this slide, Marxism will ultimately divide itself into two streams. First of all, before that, Marxism will move, people will leave Marxism. Lots of Marxists ultimately end up being what's called social democrats. Now, when I'm speaking about social democrats here in the West, I don't mean what the Russians meant when they called themselves social democrats, or even what social democracy originally meant. But once you have Edward Bernstein making the argument that with parliamentary representation, the workers, by supporting a workers' party, they can nationalise certain industries and cooperate with labour in certain ways, that you'll have a hybrid system of private property and state ownership. then you've got a very different thing to what Marx was on about. And that's why the Marxists ended up really hating the Social Democrats. But you will either go the way of Leninism, and we'll see there's a whole set of compromises and adaptations and deviations from Marx that's required to do that, or you'll go into what is really in the West. Marxism only lives in one place, and that's the universities. And then in the professions, in the minds of those professionals who've been trained and think because of what they've done in the universities. And that way of thinking is basically educational. So you do social and cultural critique, and you're basically trying to change the culture through introducing Marxian styles of analysis to look at inequality, class, though that then expands way beyond anything that Marx had thought of. That moves into identity politics. Now, this idea of what was called capturing civil society, so in a sense for the intelligentsia to make themselves indispensable within those sections of society where education was needed and important, if they could be trained with Marxian ideas, then they would help prepare the way for Marxist socialist economic revolution. There'd be a cultural revolution in a sense, followed by economic revolution. This was the brainchild of Antonio Gramsci, even though practically it's very similar to what the members of the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Max Horkheimer, were also thinking quite independently. Poor old Gramsci ends up in prison. But no, the weight of it all is around ideas. Remember me talking about ideology, going back way back to Tracy, and the setup of these alignments of ideas as part of a development of a new consciousness to change the world. But we also pointed out that Marx had said that it's not ideas that determine consciousness, but consciousness determines ideas, that consciousness is actually an outgrowth of the economic condition. What we see is a complete turning this around. It's a complete reversal of what Marx said, but it's a reversal that makes sense. It makes sense insofar as it is easier to capture the ideational narrative or the ideas and narratives that circulate within institutions, rather than capture the economy, especially when your predictions about how the economy will be transformed hasn't happened. The problem is, and it's a serious problem, if the economics is all rubbish, and I've suggested to put not too fine a word on it, it is rubbish. If it's all rubbish, then you can capture the institutions, but you're not going to change the economy, at least not in a sufficiently significant way that you want to. You may do various things that interfere with it and disrupt it, but at the end of the day, what you will find, and what you can see today, is that although Marxian intellectuals are very critical of capital with words, the actual commitments become identical to the globalist, capitalist narrative or view of reality, because they are attracting resources to themselves and they need these institutions to get the resources. Here Marx was right, we're all economic agents. This bit was right, but in a sense, Marx is just saying what any political economist knows. Political economy identifies something very real. We're all economic agents. And certain kinds of economic agents, division of labour, doing certain tasks, have to attract resources to themselves, or are seeking to attract resources to themselves. And that resource might come because of the narrative that they're able to participate in and ultimately bring to the market, which is not only, because there's rooms for it for journalists and private enterprise, but predominantly state-driven market in the university system. Again, there's private universities, but predominantly state-driven. And that is because of the internal checking process and the transformation of the culture, narrative culture, and the politicization of that. This is where we can see Marxism has been very effective. But it's effective without being in any way, shape or form coupled with the proletariat, because ultimately cultural Marxism, Gramsci never conceived this, by the way, and the Frankfurt School, though, you can already see the signs of this because they're already giving up on the working class. Gramsci doesn't. The Frankfurt School, it's very bourgeois Marxism, to put it bluntly. Now, I've just used that term, bourgeois Marxism. I think that from day one, Marx was always about the bourgeoisie in the older sense of the term, not his specific term, use of the term, but in terms of the French Revolution. That is, it's about urban professionals who have an opportunity to sell their economic agency as teachers and educators for the new world that they build by crafting and then monitoring narratives. And although very few people raise this with Marx, a guy called Landor, very late in Marx's life, interviewed him, and he brought out this point in an interview with him. So if you Google Landor, Karl Marx, you will find this. You'll find this, and he says, Marx is not a proletariat, which he isn't. And what I can see is, and Marx concedes in this that the workers will have to be educated. So they haven't come to spontaneously perceive their position and see their need. They've come to realize that, Marx realizes the truth, that really what he's done is he's had a theory and he's looking for people to teach the theory and educate the proletariat in terms of their own interests. So this is going to be very important when we come to the Russian Revolution. But it's important to understand where Marxism alive today, primarily amongst the intelligentsia, not amongst the working class, one. And two, Marxism will be so important in the Russian Revolution because the intelligentsia were such an important driving power of that revolution. Now, I'll just say one other thing. I'd mentioned this before, just pick up on this. One other thing about Marx and the Russians. We see that Marx's theory had been that capital would have to develop to such a stage where the falling rate of profit and the economic crisis was so great that the workers would take over that. That meant that the revolution would take place where capital was most prevalent, the most industrialized country. And my God, I mean, the thing is how speculative it is. In the 19th century, most of the world hasn't been industrialized. Western Europe, yes, Western Europe, some of Central Europe, North America, and Australasia, and then you've got bits and pieces and bric-a-brac of industrialization. So it's incredible that they thought that, that a socialist revolution would even remotely happen along Marx's lines. Now, I mentioned that after he's finished Capital, Marx still works away on a couple of extra volumes, which are published after his death by Friedrich Engels, who puts them together. They're a real jumble. They're notebooks. But what's happened is the theory is not being confirmed anywhere. And then out of the blue, as his ideas are being absorbed in Russia, some Russian socialists write to him and say, look, do you think we can bypass this industrialization process because we already have these communal roots due to the nature of the peasantry? So we already had this experience in cooperatives. that sets the basis for communism. Do you think this can happen? Now, had Marx been true to his theory, he should have said no way, but he goes yes. Yes, he said, look, this is not some immutable law of the spirit that's going on. You think, hang on, it wasn't meant to be an immutable law of the spirit. You had provided a formula about commodity production that was meant to demonstrate the endemic nature of the crisis, or the intrinsic nature of the crisis, the dialectical tension that would be severed. And that really just goes to show that, on the one hand, Marx is an advocate for revolution and an educator wanting to educate people to revolt. On the other hand, he's presenting himself as a scientist. And in the history of Marxism, not, by the way, the whole scientific side of Marx, which is so prevalent in Marx's own mind, is tends to be dropped by what I've called Western or academic or cultural Marxism. It tends to be completely dropped. And the reason it's dropped is because Marx had demonstrated in person, and the Russian Revolution will demonstrate in its development, when push comes to shove, it ain't got anything to do with the science. It's really an attempt to create a program, and in Marx the program is very threadbare. In the Communist Manifesto he mentions 10 points, one of which though was that agriculture would be run by an industrialized army of labourers, and that is really going to be a very fateful programmatic point, because, well, we'll talk about that later. But in the main, it's very threadbare. It doesn't really say much. It's basically a view with not much substance to it. So the substance will then be developed to try and fit this view. And of course, as the substance is developed, the view changes, or the endpoint changes drastically. So it doesn't end up looking much at all like what Marx would have wanted. But how could Marx have got what he wanted when it's too lacking in detail and too lacking in theoretical sophistication? Okay, I spent a lot of time about this, but this is when we look at why the Russian Revolution is Marxist but also deviates so far from Marxism. It's because I want you to understand these tensions and the fundamental deficiencies in the theory that the Marxists were saddled with. Now, in the series of lectures now, the rest of the lectures now on the Russian Revolution I'm going to do over the next few weeks, there are a number of myths I wanted to dispel. One is that it's good in theory and not in practice. I've given you all the arguments why that is not the case. And this argument tacitly, and this tends to be said by people who don't know what they're talking about at all. It tends to be said by people that haven't spent 5 minutes on Marx. But sometimes there are academics that have, but in the main, this is just hot air. It's nonsense. And what people don't realise is saying is that communist society there could be large-scale economic growth and continuous satisfaction that's economically viable through not having private property, not having a pricing mechanism, etc., etc. And that the other thing that's tacitly assumed is to eliminate class society would not necessarily require an apparatus of terror. What we will see, and what I would say unconditionally is the case, is to have a classless society, that is, to eliminate classes, you must have an apparatus of terror. There's simply no way you can have one without the other. Unless there was enough LSD or drugs in the water, or mescaline, or magic mushrooms that people woke up, and this would always be the case, they would always love each other. Unless it's that, forget it. 2, another myth is the Bolsheviks achieved power because of widespread popular support. This is not true. It's not. I don't want you, and I saw this in some of the assignments talking about the French Revolution, I don't want you to just talk about, you know, Russia was so oppressive and the people all revolted. This is rubbish. This is nothing. You're not saying anything. And I'm probably the people that wrote that aren't listening to the lectures. So if you're listening to the lectures, I probably don't need to remind you of this. But it's just the idea that they had widespread popular support. It was very concentrated support. And then in the Civil War, through the application of the apparatus of terror and through certain tactical and strategic decisions, some of which were much cleverer, but some of which was just terrain advantage, they were able to entrench themselves within a certain network of support. Thirdly, the idea that the revolution was a workers' revolution in the Soviet Union, a workers' state. The workers, which were a very relatively small number, concentrated in some urban areas, certainly played a part. But the idea that that is the decisive factor in dictating the course of events is not. And in fact, had it not been for the First World War, as we will see, this would not have occurred. The other myth is that it was a workers' state because of the Soviets. It's something that Trotskyists tend to argue. It was a workers' state, but then it became a deformed version of bureaucratic. Well, we'll talk about the Soviets later, but we'll see this is again, it's just not true. It was definitely a new hybrid kind of state. That's true. But to call it it was a bureaucratic state, absolutely. But if you don't have any kind of dynastic succession, if you don't have parliament, then ultimately you're going to have rule by those people administering the state, which in this case is the party. Not only administering, but dictating the program. Another argument you sometimes see is that the revolution in Russia was a necessary condition of Russia's modernization, that it never would. Now remember, well, as we will talk about, there were in 1917, there's two revolutions. One is the so-called February Revolution, and the next one's the so-called October Revolution. Because of the calendar, it doesn't mean they actually quite happen on those dates, but calendar changes, don't bother about that. Okay. Even some people, I think, have written good books. I've heard Stephen Cohen say this, who wrote a very good book on Bukharin. Isaac Deutscher, who's a Trotskyist, at the end of his book on Stalin, which is very critical of Stalin in all sorts of ways, says this. I think this is a complete and utter fantasy. It's true that once you had the chaos and the mess that was created in the throes of the Leninist seizure of power and that chaos, then Stalin gets you out of that chaos. That's true. And as you'll see from my take on Stalin, the idea that Stalin, and this brings us to the next point, is not a genuine Marxist-Leninist, and the revolution goes off course with him, is a complete fabrication. It's total nonsense. And I'm amazed that some academics still reproduce this, but one of the reasons they reproduce it is because there has been this underlying, and for decades, during the revolution and in its aftermath for 40 or 50 years, and there's still some of it today. It's not the dominant position of scholars on the Russian Revolution, but there are still some scholars who are so sympathetic with the revolution because they tend to buy these other myths. And they tend to argue that Stalin was not a genuine Marxist, that he was doing it for personal power or God knows what. And we will see this is just rubbish. And this is the Trotskyist line as well. And I'll talk about Trotsky. I'm very critical of Trotsky. And in my youth, Trotskyism and Marxism were really it looked like, when I first went to uni, it looked like all the smart people were Marxists and the smartest were Trotskyists. And now, as I've learnt more and got older and read more, I just think they were brazenly brash know-it-alls who really knew very little, whose knowledge of history was so distorted, and they'd read a few books on the Russian Revolution that come out with this nonsense. And the final myth is that it sort of picks up from this. It's not only that Stalin was not a genuine Marxist-Leninist, it's like, well, the old left and the new left are so different, because the new left, and we'll talk about this in a later lecture, basically, although you can try find the roots of it back in the Frankfurt School, so going way back to the 1920s and 30s, really it becomes a dominant intellectual position. So it's really congruent with Western Marxism, academic Marxism, during the 1960s. And they have basically lived at a time where even Khrushchev who taken over the leadership of the Soviet Union, had denounced Stalin. And a myth formed that basically, you know, anyone who was smart knew that Stalin was a bad egg. And all of this is because of how much death occurs through the collectivization project and the Red Terror of Stalin. I said the Red Terror, the purges of Stalin. I can tell you in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, almost all Marxists were pro-Stalin. Almost all Marxists were pro-Stalin. Uncle Joe, when the United States enters the Second World War and it's in cooperation with the Soviets, this idea of Joe Stalin being this lovely, benign figure, Uncle Joe, just like you can hear Uncle Sam in that, Uncle Joe, Uncle Sam, they're cooperating. This kind of myth, and it's really fueled, especially by not only American, also British, but by communist sympathizers, of whom there are quite a number, even working in the American government, so in the staff department, especially at lower levels, in universities, not everywhere. It's not like everywhere, but there was quite a lot of intellectual sympathy for the Stalinists, and that extended to publishing houses, for example. So again, the intelligentsia, and this has been the case since the Russian Revolution, although there were certain books, even written by some socialists, around the time the Russian Revolution first took off. So they're often writing, so books coming out in 1919, 1920, 1921, that are drawing attention to the mass killing that's going on in the Russian Revolution. There's also a much larger literature, being a set of books coming out by journalists. John Reed's famous 10 Days That Shook the World is a book that perhaps everybody should read, in which we can see how the intelligentsia is so supportive of the revolution. And it comes, and again, British intellectuals like George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, all these writers, I'll bring this up again later, but all these writers, the Webbs, they're all very sympathetic to the Soviet project. And the reason they're sympathetic to it, in a nutshell, is because this is the first time in history that the intelligentsia, even more so than that momentary phase of the French Revolution under the Montagnards, this is the first time in history where a theory completely is going to dictate reality, and so intellectuals are the most important components of this revolution, at least in their own mind. And you can see this is, so naturally they would be attracted to it because the ideas sound good to them, because again they haven't done the modeling and the I'll just say that the lack of deployment of critical faculties against this, as opposed to being critical of all the problems that accompany capitalism, private investment, modern industrial, liberal democratic societies, of which there are plenty of problems, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of problems. The question is that this was something that was supposed to break with any of those problems, all of those problems. And what we see is created a whole set of other problems of its own. In many ways, problems that are worse. Okay. I had mentioned this. So, yeah, I don't need to say this. What exactly was the Russian Revolution? We'll see how Marx's role fits into this, but we've got to go way back, and we need to understand some fundamentals about Russian society. Remember when we talked about the French Revolution, and those of you that did good papers, assignments on the French Revolution, I could hear were taking note of these lectures. And I put a lot of effort into these lectures. I spent years and years preparing for this very subject, and I've been reading at different points in my life over my whole lifetime about the French and Russian Revolution. But I spent about 3 years really intensively reading about this stuff before I did the course, because I really wanted to clarify all this for myself. And when I came to do the course, I realized how many things fitted into place that I never realized when I originally dreamed of doing the course. Okay, but one thing, as we pointed out, the French Revolution was very much a response to French circumstances. But the French Revolution also became a kind of model for export. Exactly the same with the Russian Revolution. It's exactly the same. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet system will provide, and the Leninist Party will provide, a kind of model for other socialists and communists to try and follow. And then, of course, it all falls apart. But the mistake in this is thinking that the conditions that give rise to revolution are so similar that they can be replicated. And a further problem was that the solution to the social breakdown of the revolution, the socialist/communist solution, became instantiated, the more we could see that it brought with it a whole other set of problems, in many ways much, much bigger problems than had existed before the revolution. Now, having said that, the problems were clearly of such a magnitude in Russia that, and we'll see why this is the case, that there was something almost inevitable about revolution. I say almost. Here's a rub. Certainly you had this class consciousness and hostility towards the autocracy so great. And the role of the intelligentsia, as we will see, is going to be decisive. And why that is the case and how it wasn't easy to deal with them is going to be really important. So in that sense, you had a class really on the lookout for revolution. But it may have been, had Russia been able to continue the tremendous rate of modernizing and economic development that it was in a relatively incipient phase of, might have been able to build up other classes in the cities that would have counterbalanced those classes. But the war destroyed any prospect of that. The war destroyed any prospect of that. So in the sense, once you had the war, I think there's a certain degree of inevitability about it. And that's similar with the French Revolution. Once all the things fall into place, you start to see, I don't know how, I said to you before, I don't know how Louis could have avoided it, and I don't know how the Tsar could have avoided it. There's too many problems, and the institutional structures that are operative simply weren't designed with those problems in mind, and they sink beneath the problems. Okay. So we'll go right back, and I'm going to be going to and fro because some of this is thematic and some of it's chronological. So I'll be moving backwards and forwards. The biggest issue facing Russia at the beginning of the 19th century. Remember, Russia is a sizable empire. It's had rulers such as Ivan the Terrible, basically, in many ways, unites modern Russia. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. So it's a major imperial player with a sizable army, but it's incredibly underdeveloped. And if the leadership, the elite, wanted Russia to be a major power, they were going to have to develop. So there is a push, and it's initially elite driven, to modernize. And you can only modernize if you've got a flexible labor force. And a flexible labor force is not one where you've got serfdom. Because where you've got serfdom, you've got all this labor pool bound up with working on the land, because you might own, in your own mind, you own the land, but your owner, you are owned by your lord. So you're owned. So this is still a serf system. It's, and in many ways, and serfdom is not abolished until the 1860s. Now, it's really, again, we tend to use these big words like oppressed and oppressor, and these are very, very simplistic words. They're really cheap abstractions that the intelligentsia often use, and educated people at dinner parties and journalists often use these terms, but they're really, you've got to look at the historical conditions under which things have developed. You've got to see the alternatives. You've got to understand why it is this way. There's no reason on earth, in fact, it's the opposite. It's absolutely impossible for people to have lived in a world where there was plenty and no scarcity, and all the conditions of modernity which alleviate the burdens of labour and change the nature of class relationships. This all got developed historically under conditions that were nothing like those which eventually come out. So there was serfdom. The serf gives so much of their produce to the lord, but as far as they're concerned, they own that land. Now, the lord has all sorts of latitude in how they can deal with their property, and their property being the serf. Now, and they were often cruel. I'll come back to that. They were. There's sufficient reports that indicate that they were cruel. There's also very sporadic uprisings, and it does seem to be localized and regionalized. It depended who your lord was, and you might get really pissed off with him, and the serfs in that area can't stand it. But, and here's the point, there was no serf revolt against serfdom as such. There were sporadic uprisings. Now, the empire itself was relatively stable, and it was, in the 1860s, it was the third largest empire in history. It's a very big empire. It's relatively stable. As everywhere tends to be like this in the pre-modern times. The serfs, nobility, and the Russian state, they tended to form a relationship of mutual dependency. And you might recall me, I may not have done it here, I may have done that in my class on political ideas, and forgive me if I'm wrong here, but as the state in France, no, I did talk about this, as the state in France starts to centralize, that is predicated upon changing the nature between crown and nobles. And we see a very similar story taking place in Russia. And what is happening is this kind of adaptation of what you have to work with, which is basically your past, your heritage, and the conditions that are facing you right now because of that past and heritage. And at different times, one of these players might want to realign or take itself out of that arrangement. And generally, you could say, for example, the nobles, they resented having to work to do state service. And the state had a superfluous number of noble officers in times. So this is a kind of problem. And there's uneasy relations at times between serfs and their nobles. But it doesn't mean that the whole place is just a powder keg ready to explode. That would be a false picture. The other thing, and again, this is why this word oppression and oppressed is just too simplistic. It's not in the interests of nobles or the state to attract too much surplus. Because if you do that, then you'll kill the golden goose. And the first surplus obviously is grain, and then other things that you sell. But it can be meat, it can be grain, you know what. So it's ultimately, and it's not as if the state was the obvious way out. And this is the thing, when you get rid of serfdom, it's not that the peasant is going to give up less of their resources, it'll just be in another form. That is, they're going to be taxed, which is essentially what is happening with their lord anyway. They're being taxed. So the difference is relatively not so great. The lifestyle that you have, your day-to-day life, is not going to be, unless you've got a cruel lord, that's true. But under normal conditions, it's quite possible for the state to be far crueler than the lords. And this is what we'll see this with the collectivization of agriculture under Stalin. We'll see it. It's far crueler than anything that the nobles are doing, or the landlords are doing. So there's this kind of adjustment. They're learning to get by. Yes, it's not even. Of course it's not equal. But the world was never equal. The world has always been about different obligations, different sacrificial obligations. And you recall initially, the nobles were the nobles because they were a warrior class. They were prepared to, they got their privileges because they were prepared to die and to kill. And they were protecting, but they would also attack other serfs, etc. But they were protecting the peasantry who were for them. So that's the payoff. They're protecting them, but of course they're also exploiting them, if you want to use that term. And ultimately you see, well, yeah, it's a mix and match. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say here is about not wanting to kill the golden goose. It was very clear that in poor harvests, and in 1892, something like 500,000 peasants died. And that was in the aftermath of a harvest due to cholera. But in bad times, it was a real question of, are you going to let all the serfs die? No. The state tried to compel landowners to feed the serfs, or you find other means of famine relief or market control of grain prices. So the idea that they would just, you know, that they're human flotsam and they don't matter at all, this is too simplistic. Now, I'm not trying to defend this. It's not about defending. It's not as if I'm going to dream up a new world. First of all, I don't trust any world any intellectual dreams up, because their world is only as good as their brain, and most of our brains, sorry. None of us are very smart. You've read a few thousand books, big deal. We know so little. We all know so little. And one of the things that, in a sense, that where I differ from other people who lecture on this stuff, not all, but a number, is I start with a very considerably skeptical view about the power of intelligence to shape the world the way it wants. What I see is intelligence can only have so many variables that it entertains mind, and it always omits, doesn't notice things. And hence any attempt to plan things is always going to miss a lot, and the problems that might be bigger than the solution. But as I said, when you all these things as they accrue, these problems build up, then the changes, it comes out of this explosion of the different processes. Okay. So it's not about defending this system. I'm trying to get you to see why there was no rebellion against serfdom as such, why people went along with it, and ultimately why, to get a sense of what the peasant wanted, where they would ultimately align with the socialists, and ultimately where they would be crushed by the socialists. They would be the biggest losers of all in the Russian Revolution, would be the peasantry. There were also various times in which landowners, although they had a certain amount of autonomy, they could whip a slave, a serf, sorry, they could whip their serfs, they could take conjugal rights. You know, this is quite terrible, and they would do this. Sometimes they would kill someone, but it was also not completely tolerated. And in between 1834 and 1845, and again, it depended who was ruling, and it depended on the conditions of the time or whether there's any enforcement. But something a little less than 3,000 landowners were tried for mistreating serfs. So why is that? Again, because basically the state is wanting to, and the autocracy, and it's a very autocratic system, is ultimately wanting to have the show perpetuate itself. It's wanting to endure, and it can't endure if the whole thing is going to be chaos. So it's got to have these checks, relative, very relative checks and balances. Of course, not evenly spread. Of course not. So now the thing about the peasants and why they're willing to accept this, it's basically a lifestyle of subsistence, not capital accumulation. And they're able to build their lives not only around you, but within their community. And much of that life can be very enjoyable. It doesn't mean you have all the mod cons of everything, but to some extent, once you've paid off enough the taxes or the extraction being taken from you by the serf owner, once you've done that, you can pretty well work your own hours. So this will be, a lot of this, as we'll come to later, was very communally owned. So they had to, amongst themselves, make all these decisions. But it was a way of life which could be very joyful for some. Now, you age pretty rapidly. It's a hard life. But the alternatives, and they didn't, it's not like they could buy their way into the next class. But there weren't many alternatives. You could go off work in a village, and many peasants ended up, especially as the industrialization process starts to work, events drift out. You might end up in the army. That's going to be a big issue, and that wasn't so great. You just basically got to along with your life, and believe it or not, politics was not a major interest or concern of these people. What would happen, as we will see, is once the intelligentsia is looking for a program and a group to educate and support them, it will hit upon ideas of the peasantry and try and form this alignment and connections with the peasantry because it wants to be their saviours and educators. Very similar to what Marx had done with the working class. It wants to save and educate them simultaneously. So, as I said, whether you work for the state or for your noble or for the lord, it doesn't really matter. So there was, and the other thing was, initially, it had been the state that had tried to reform serfdom, try to make the changes, and there just wasn't enough support, widespread, and there were too many interests against being able to do it. But ultimately, the Crimean War, as I put in the last one, showed that this was not working, and Russia had lost the war. It was a war against England and France and the Ottomans, and they needed to modernize the army, and that also that came into it because the structure of the army would be very important in No, let me say that again. In the army would be a very important institution in this bigger story that we're telling, and of course it's absolutely necessary for any kind of empire. Russian power depended upon a large army. It was mainly made up of landowners who formed the officer corps and cavalry, but the serfs and peasants were the foot soldiers. So often they could just be swept up and dragooned into the army. Most of them didn't like this at all. And they'd have to serve for 25 years. So being emancipated was also changed the structure of the army. And that's, again, you can see you change one thing, you have to do X, Y, Z, and all these other things. That because everything's so systematized. But as I said, the peasants would still have to work relatively long hours, no matter who they were working for. But this thing about the army was something that did. In 1762, with the abolition of compulsory noble state service, meant that the military function of serfdom was now an anachronism. So the state had little need for nobles, but that didn't mean that the nobles were therefore just as a class going to up and go away. They've still got to make their way in the world. Just, everybody has their interests. I keep saying this. They wake up in the morning, this is your day, and you don't want it radically changed. You don't want to lose your job. You don't want to use your position. You don't want a whole set of new rules. People, no matter what, will resist this. Industry is going to be really important. Now, although Peter and Catherine had done various things, remember they're operating in the pre-industrial revolution time. Once you've got the industrial revolution, now the intensification of the means of production, the increase of the scale of production, the combination of science, technology, and division of labour, these all come into play. The factories, they start to dot the landscape, increasingly so. Railroads are needed, communication systems again. This really starts to take off in the latter part of the 19th century. But it's only then. So Russia has had, to put it bluntly, very little time to deal with the new class system that accompanies rapid industrialization. In the 1860s, that should be, the proportion of city works to peasants was 1 to 100. So that gives you a good idea of how relatively few they were. The problem was that no reform would be quick enough, because one of the logics of societies in competition with each other for resources, for commodities, which they are, is that it's not just a question of keeping up with. If you don't keep up with, the bottom is a very long way down. The amount of unemployment, the failure to be able to sell stuff. So modernization is like it's like a treadmill that you don't get on, it's going to be much harder to get on later, and when you try and jump off, you're in trouble. So no reform was going to be quick enough, and the intelligentsia by this stage had already positioned themselves against the ruling classes in Russia, and were basically had positioned themselves to be the next ruling class. And it would be the ruling class on the basis of the quality, according to itself, of the ideas that it pushed would help transform Russia and make it all good. Alexander II was assassinated by the members of the Narodnaya Volya. We'll come back to them later, but they're one of the many revolutionary groups at the time. But Alexander, he had abolished serfdom. He had introduced a Western-style legal system. He had drastically reduced military service from 25 to 6 years. He was attempting constitutional reform. No, it's not the peasantry. It's not the serfs that have killed Alexander. It's the intelligentsia. And this when we compare this to the French Revolution, what we notice is how you've already got a class of revolutionaries well and truly trained and prepared coming out of the intelligentsia long before there's a revolution, which is not what you had in France. You didn't have that. You certainly had people with ideas, with books and revolutionary ideas, but you didn't have that institutional dependency, which is what develops in Russia. The dependency of the society in creating professionals, and those professionals then devoted almost to a person, but a lot of them anyway, devoted to overthrowing the very government that's in place from the outset. I also want to talk about the Russian church. This is again something that shows the difference between what's going on in France. In the West, there had been all sorts of revolutions that had taken place because that had involved the church. But the Orthodox Church had broken with Rome in the middle of the 11th century. So all these other movements had essentially bypassed Russia. It's not that they were unaware, but they hadn't impacted on Russia by any means in the way they had in the West. Ultimately, the revolts in Western Europe that took place within the church had facilitated a less autocratic social outlook, even when absolute states were arriving. And although one of the myths of the French Revolution was how, because of the political power held by the first estate, the churches, how they dictated so much to the rest of the people because of the privileges they had. In point of fact, that's a gross oversimplification. And had they been able to do so, then they would have, or had that been the case, then they would have prevented the rise of deism, the rise of the Freemasons, the rise of the Enlightened, and they didn't prevent that at all. And in fact, there were the first atheist in France, the first author who's openly atheist, and it's only after his death was a priest. So that gives you an idea of the kind of things that are happening in Western Europe. Now, in the main, the Russian church had been a bastion of tradition, not revolt, whereas in all these things, the papal, Italian, German, and English revolution, they're all revolutions. The church, on the other hand, in Russia, has not been bound up with revolution. If you do my political ideas course, you'll see how I talk at some length about all those revolutions, the German Revolution being the Reformation, the Italian Revolution being the Renaissance. But okay. The Russian Empire contained many religious ethnic groups, but it was by far the Russian church which was a dominant religious institution. Now that church under Ivan had already been a national church, which is what had occurred in France. And of course, in much of Western Europe was the Reformation that nationalized the church by severing ties with Rome. But this wasn't needed here in Russia. And Peter the Great, again, part of his modernization push, he had abolished the position of the patriarch, and the Orthodox Church had always revolved around the patriarch being like a kind of more pluralist version of the papacy. And so the different centers of Christendom under the Orthodox model would have the different patriarch. And he makes the church a kind of state department. And he establishes something that's based upon the Lutheran model. So he sees that's going on and he uses it. Also, a number of monasteries had been closed down. And So the kind of nationalisation and confiscation of church land, not as extensive, but still nevertheless taking place, and the Russian Revolution will finish off this job. But it had really already been largely undertaken under Catherine the Great. So what you can see with both Peter and Catherine is that a lot of these enlightened ideas, even post-Reformation ideas, so they're very aware of what's happening in Western Europe. And although these big events have bypassed the Russian church, through fiat, there's certain transformations to the church that have taken place. And this, as I said, this confiscation of church lands and closing of monasteries is a big deal. And priests often treated as state functionaries. And they were even expected to report on opponents to the Tsar. But of course, this is going to be different to what's happening in France, because the autocracy very much depends upon the church and upon the faith. Whereas obviously what happens in the French Revolution is that the civil constitution is really a way of destroying the church within and just turning it exclusively into functionaries. And that, you recall the conflict then that takes place between Robespierre and Jacques Desbert over exactly where the church should figure and the state should figure. And Desbert wants to push ahead the de-Christianization process, and much more true to Rousseau in his way, Robespierre wants to seize a need for some kind of rite and ritual to maintain the church. But in the case of Russia, there's still much more, especially after Catherine, I think even more so, there's much more of a kind of cultural role for the church, in which the leading authorities and the clerics all of a piece in terms of kind of Russian society, Mother Russia. So this also means that whereas in the development of Western Christendom, in the first instance, up until around the time, of course there's some exceptions to this, but up until the 30 Years' War, remember Descartes had fought in that war, and he emerges from that war with basically a secular intellectual. Most of the intelligentsia in Western Europe had been churchmen, or in some way so close to the church. Not all, but many were. Often they had been, even someone like Rabelais, who you recall, I mentioned in an earlier lecture. Rabelais was this, who writes this very anti-Christian tract, is a churchman, you know, is a monk, or is a cleric. So, or priest. The conflict of the rising intelligentsia in Western Europe really had to get rid of the the clerical intelligentsia. This is not so much the case in Russia. They don't play such an important role. Of course, there's some, but it's not, and in part that's because this is largely a very illiterate society. You don't have the number of urban centres. So although that you have in Western Europe, it's still much more agrarian. Even though France, of course, was largely agrarian, but still there were a number of more towns. We recall the Huguenots, this literate group, the Protestants in France. In Russia, predominantly an uneducated society. So this is why the intelligentsia are going to be a very small but ultimately very important group. Of the non-noble intelligentsia in the second half of the 19th century, large part, were sons of priests. And as in Western Europe, the priesthood was really a career opportunity. People were just, You can either be a peasant, you can be this, you can be a soldier, you can be this or that. You might drift into the village, or you can join the church. I know a lot of people in the church, and in the church they could get an education. It might be pretty rudimentary. It depended. The further on you got, but ultimately, it was a set of opportunities. So you would get people drifting away from that to join the intelligentsia once the universities start to grow in Russia. In the main, the church was very anti-Semitic, and the role of the Jews in the revolution is going to be very important. It's not true, and I'll state this from the outside, it's not true that all the Jews were communists or socialists. It is true, as we will see, that many of the leading, not all, but a disproportionate number, though there's no reason on earth why numbers should be proportionate around this, but let's just say a disproportionate number compared to the rest of the population of the leading members of the socialist movement were Jews. In part, that is as a reaction to the anti-Semitic dimensions and the treatment of the Jews, which would often figure pogroms, and the lack of opportunities for Jews, which was in part also exacerbated by the church in Russia. Now, going back to the peasants for a moment, they would be at the center of revolutionary Russian thought, though not as actors so much, but as kind of as a mass that provided potential and opportunity for the intelligentsia to forge its ideas about how Russia could be saved. They tended to be idealized. The actors mainly came out of the gentry. And that's the intelligentsia initially come out of the gentry. In the first instance, as we will see with the Decembrist revolt, they come out of the army. But then the student body, the intelligentsia. I've made that point. The revolutionaries preceded the revolution. What we'll also see in Russia is this interesting contradiction. On the one hand, and as we look at the various intellectual revolutionary leading lights, most of them, in fact, pretty well all of them, I'm trying to think of an exception, had travelled in Western Europe, where they had met with French socialists and German philosophers of the very sort that Marx had been mingling with. Some had met Marx. And this was going to be really where they sharpen, in a sense, their toolkit of revolution. But then, because of Russia being very different circumstances, and because there's barely, especially up until around the time of the revolution, that there's barely any proletariat. We'll see that a couple of million, but they side with the peasants. The peasants for them are the touchstone of the oppressed. So their radical views will have to take into account the needs of the peasantry. But it's because of this too, because of the very radical nature of the intelligentsia, that in the main, there's some exceptions to this, but certainly the leading lights of the socialist movement, they're not interested for a moment in something like constitutional monarchy. There's some players that are, but they're not the ones that really matter. In fact, in Russia, to put it bluntly, when you're looking at 19th century intelligentsia, it's not the liberals that you're looking at, it's the socialists, the anarchists, the communists, socialists and communists being all of the piece. It's the radical populists. It's also, in terms of, if we put this in terms of comparing this with the what's going on in the French Revolution, it's the very left wing, it's the ultra-left position that now is the go-to position. Even from this position, even Robespierre would be too moderate. You'd be closer to the Enragé of Jacques Roux or Jacques Tébert, which of course they fell out amongst themselves as well, but that's another question. So, going forward, the major revolutionary social players are going to be the students and intelligentsia. They will ultimately dictate the shape of the revolutionary parties. Full-time revolutionaries, they're one and the same. Industrial workers, because of what's going on in the urban centres. Many of them, though, are going to be basically their former peasants who've drifted into cities. The peasantry and disaffected and radicalised sectors of the military. So they're going to be the major players that will be. Now, before I'll end this, I'll get up to the Decembrists today, not quite as far as I wanted to get. So I've got a few more slides to go, but so I might go over for lecture for 10 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes. But I do want to talk about this because this, I've called it a strange prelude to the revolution, and it's very bizarre. And Richard Pipes, who was a very anti-communist, he was Polish. He was a Polish refugee. If he wasn't anti-communist, he'd be a lunatic. But many people reject his books because they're saying, oh, he was just an anti-communist. Well, I'm sorry, but I think Richard Pipes was a pretty astute analyst of the revolution. And the major reason I like Pipes' work on the revolution is the focus he brings to bear on the role of the intelligentsia within it. I think he's probably the best at drawing attention to that dimension of the revolution. Okay, so he wrote an article on this, and I think it's an excellent article. And it is really bizarre, because what you've got is an attempt at something that is ultimately very much like what happens in the Russian Revolution. Only it's led by the Tsar. It's led by the Tsar. So it'll fade into obscurity. It's not going to be an important part of the historical memory. But it gives you an idea of the way in which someone at the top who's wanting to improve the society to solve a problem is thinking given the conditions under which he is working. And it won't be a million miles away from what he's ended up with. So the problem that Alexander faced was he had a budget problem. He had a huge army, which would be essential in the fight against Napoleon. But when Napoleon is being defeated, once defeated, is what are you going to do with all these soldiers? And he thinks, we don't just want them hanging around doing nothing, but we don't want to just disband the army. And he thinks of, okay, we've got to modernize. We'll modernize, and this is very technocratic, quasi-socialistic. It's not, obviously it's not politically socialistic in terms of getting rid of the autocracy, but it's socialistic in terms of coming up with an idea for the means of production in which you're trying to get this large-scale cooperation happening, and you're not really caring about capital investment as such. You're basically bringing peasants and soldiers together to build a new kind of community. And this involved, it's no small affair, it's 750,000 people. And the idea was that peasant soldiers would be created, so that, in a sense, the soldiers would become like, do the things peasants do, and the peasants would do the things that soldiers do. And this would, they would cultivate land, they would build infrastructure, they would manufacture, they'd be prepared for war, transferred to battle when needed. They would be isolated from the rest of Russian society. So just, you might remember after the revolution, one of the things the communists will do will isolate Russia from the rest of the world as far as it can. It won't let people come in or out, except under very, very specific conditions. And the reason is he wants this collective group to develop a esprit de corps where they all identify their interests and they will all ultimately cooperate and they won't be corrupted by outside influences. There's an attempt, at some extent, not complete, to equalise wealth, attempt to eliminate poverty, land is divided to ensure a minimum, any personal loan is seen as a village loan. See, this is very communistic. And as with what happened in the Soviet Union, there were all these reports that were coming out of what was going on as if this was a great success. And it was just like, you know, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s, all these people, I mentioned George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, they go off and visit the Soviet Union, the Webbs, they go and visit it, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, they go and visit it, and they come back with these glowing reports like heaven is being built on earth. And the odd person writes something critical of it when they tend to be ostracized for doing it. Andre Gide, the French novelist, very supportive of the Russian Revolution, goes there and he starts to smell a rat, writes about that. And the idea of Potemkin villages comes to mind. That is that under Catherine the Great, this character called Potemkin created all these facades to give Catherine the impression that all these great developments were going ahead and everyone was living perfectly well and there was nothing there. Ultimately, this was a disaster. There was corruption, bureaucratic overkill. The peasants didn't want to be military, and and the military looked down at the peasantry. There was inefficient, there were peasant riots. It was a complete and utter disaster. In some kind of way, in miniature, it's so predictive about what will happen. And it's so top-down directed, and that will be the feature about the Russian Revolution, is that it has been prepared for by elites. There has been tumult from these underclasses, in part precipitated by the war, but it will always be elite-driven. And when we talk about the Soviets, because one of the myths is, oh, no, that's not true, it was really the will of the people in the Soviets, we'll see that the Soviets themselves were captured by the elite, were really an extension of the interests of the elite. But it's the Decembrist movement that in many ways you could say is the first revolution. It's not wrong to say that the Decembrists were the first revolution, the second revolution was in 1905, the third revolution was in February 1917, and the fourth revolution was October 1917. There's some truth in that. Certainly it's a rebellion, but it's a rebellion in which disaffected members of the army are driven by ideas that have come from the West. They want to modernize. They see all these faults with the autocracy, and they have their own grievances within the army. A number of the officers, by the way, so first it begins, it's a revolt of an army officers protesting against Nicholas I coming to power. So they didn't approve that. They had no right, by the way, to approve or not approve. That wasn't their business. But they were treating the election as if somehow they had a stake in the system in which they should have had the right to dictate who should lead. And of course, elite groups do this all the time. If they don't get the person they want or the things they want, they will work to try and overthrow this. It happens all the time. They had, a number of army officers had also been motivated and inspired by the events in the American-Russian Revolution. But generally, these leading officials in the army, like the other members of the Russian elite, they had been exposed to Western intellectual ideas. But during the Napoleonic War, they had also fought alongside peasant soldiers, and they tended to identify with the cause of self-serf emancipation. Now, as I said, often the peasants themselves weren't that interested in emancipation, but Because they were also interested in modernizing and wanted to therefore align with the manufacturers, they were thinking about what kind of social shape the society should have. And unlike the radical intelligentsia later, they were much more constitutionally driven. The fact was also that at the time that Nicholas had come to power, Russia had a huge national debt, the state was bankrupt. So all of this is happening, and at the same time, this is just preceding this. There will be a great need to educate professional engineers, scientists, lawyers, accountants, doctors, and so on. This would be a running sword. Eventually, so I'm leaping a bit ahead here, censorship in the second half of Alexander I's regime would occur because it was seen that there's starting to be all these enemies within the elite. The other thing I should just mention, and this relates to the Decembrists, is that very often there were those that were basically looking to the West and wanting to emulate the West, and there were others that were saying it's the Russian spirit that is all and everything, and we should not follow the West. And in some ways, it's a fusion of these things that will live. Now, a number of the Decembrists have been Freemasons. You remember me talking about them. These secret lodges, which were a basic place in a site for discussion of revolutionary ideas, theological ideas, all these ideas which were basically seen as a threat to the older order. And even in 1810, the government inspected all the Freemason lodges and decided this was going to be a problem. The trigger for the revolt was the hostility of the officers, soldiers, to corporal punishment, and a mutiny that took place in 1820 when the highly decorated soldiers were flogged for disobedience, and this would rankle away. Ultimately, this group of officers, there were some in the north, some based in they were called the Northern Society and Southern Society, obviously regionally based. The Southern Society was the more revolutionary of the two. It had even gone so far as to talk about executing the royal family. So this was very ominous because it starts to use terror as part of a tactic of social transformation. The issue of, and what's interesting is the issue of different minorities, because the Russian Empire had all these other ethnic groups within them. And this will continue to be a problem that has to be dealt with throughout not only the Russian Empire, but then the Soviet Empire. It's interesting that Pastel, the leader of the Southern Society, would grant Poland independence, but all the others would stay with Russia. So there's this really serious, long fuse issue that will, in fact, it will not only be a problem at the start of the revolution, in the Civil War, but it will also still be a kind of ticking time bomb that leads to the demise of the Soviet Union. The Decembrist revolt, there were two revolts, one in the north and south, but it simply didn't have the numbers. It was a hopeless in terms of the strategy, the tactics, what they tried to do, and it just failed. They had hoped that the people would all rise up as one when led by this group, and it didn't happen. Some of the leaders were executed. Most got sent to Siberia. But in the imagination, in the collective memory, in the mind of the next generation, the Decembrists were heroes, martyrs, and victims of Russian autocracy. And ultimately, it is true that the Decembrist revolt created a great deal of resolve by the Tsar to crush insubordination and to infiltrate secret societies, to censor more, and ultimately to be more suspicious of reform, because reform could be seen as an incubating ground for revolutionary. And this is part of the tragedy of the revolution, is that the reform is both necessary, but the reform is also what is undoing the very political authorities of Russia. And the older elite is ultimately going to be eaten up by the reforms, but at the same time, without the reforms, there won't be anything to preside over. So they're absolutely overpowered. Radicalism would shift from the army to the intelligentsia. And I mentioned then the defeat of Russia in the Crimean War would be an important trigger. Okay, we'll carry on next week, and we'll carry on next week talking about students and terrorism and going more into the details of how the revolution is set up.